I'd like to talk to you this morning. Well, I'd like to get us started. Then you're going to talk to each other, and then we'll have plenty of time for some discussion about evangelism and discipleship in the context of human development. And I would like to draw from a book I wrote called Faith After Doubt that some of you may have read. I grew up fundamentalist. I grew up so fundamentalist that we thought Southern Baptists were kind of liberal. And Methodists, and I kind of knew I was in trouble. I was a kid who loved science. I loved stars and planets, and I loved learning about dinosaurs and fossils. And so really, by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, I knew a lot about evolution, and it made a whole lot of sense. And I found out that I wasn't allowed to believe in it. So I thought, okay, by this time I'm 10 or 11 years old. I'm thinking 6 or 7 years from now, and I am out of here, and I'll be done with this. And then I ended up having a very powerful spiritual experience in my teenage years and found myself on the path as a follower of Christ, but sitting uneasily with the religious community that I had grown up with. And my whole life has lived with that tension. I ended up becoming a church planter and pastor kind of by accident. My wife and I I was a college English teacher, and I would meet people. Sometimes it was faculty, sometimes it was students, sometimes it was homeless people, and I'd invite them over for dinner. My wife was a high school teacher, and she'd come home, and I'd have 5 people there, and I was making soup or something. And so we made a deal. She said, only invite people over on Thursdays. And one thing led to another, and that became a little fellowship, and it ended up becoming a little church. So when the bishop was talking this morning just about making connections with people, that is, I could not agree more. I ended up leaving teaching. I became a pastor. But while I was in a kind of dual situation working, I had a job as a teacher while I was in graduate school at my university, and I was helping start this little church. I got invited to a one-day seminar for faculty. Some of you probably know this, but many college professors have never studied education. Sometimes it shows. But, they're really experts in their field, but they might not know a lot about education. And so what happened is in the English department, they said, hey, you're invited to this free one-day seminar to basically help educators learn about education and not just their subject area. So I went, and the presenter was a specialist in human development, and what she did that day is she said, look, because most college students are between the ages of 18 and 28, we want to help you understand the brains of people between 18 and 28. And how they think and what they're going through and how they learn. Later on, I got involved in adult education, where then I had to learn more about how people over the ages of 18 and 28 learn. And there are interesting transitions that happen. And this ended up interesting me that day because I was there for my profession. But when they were explaining how adolescent brains change and how adolescents learn, I felt like I was having kind of a spiritual experience. Because the struggles I was going through in my spiritual life, the questions, the doubts, the theological struggles, I felt like that educator made more sense of them that day in terms of human development than anyone had ever made sense to me talking strictly about theology. Does that make sense? And so I ended up, the theorist that I was introduced to that day was the third on this list, William Perry. But I realized that already in my English world, in literature, I learned about William Blake, who had a theory of human development in the early 1800s. Right about the same time, the Danish philosopher and Søren Kierkegaard had his own theory. And then many people, if you went to seminary, good chance you studied James Fowler or James Kohlberg. And then a lot of people noticed that James Fowler and James Kohlberg, as white males, most of their study sample was also white males. And so there was a group of feminist human developmentalists who started saying, hey, if you actually listen to women, you might learn something. And so there was a really fascinating dialogue in the last couple of decades in that realm as well. I should also say in the last 20 or 30 years, let's see, I'm not inside of the state of Florida. I live in Florida, so I can say the word critical race theory here. I can't say it in Florida if I was in a public school at least. But what's happened in the last few decades is there's been this explosion of research about racial identity development. And so, what is it like to be a first-generation Korean immigrant growing up in a predominantly white area? What is it like to be a Zimbabwean refugee in South Africa where you're a minority group who is having all kinds of stereotypes putting on you? How does your identity develop? So there's just so much exciting research about all of these areas of human development. And what I've done over the years is try to integrate the different theorists that I've read with my own experience and my life. I was a pastor for 24 years. And what I'd like to share with you, I think could really be helpful to you in your congregational work, a very simple 4-stage framework. Simplicity, complexity, perplexity, harmony. I'm going to complicate it a little bit because life is never as simple as a model like this. And I'm also going to give you a stage 0. But let's jump in. Stage 1 is where almost all children are in elementary school. And many people stay at this stage of intellectual development through their whole lives. I'm going to call it simplicity. It's the dualistic framework. When you think about it, when you're a child, you have matters of life and death. You're kind of new on this planet, and you need some guidance and orientation. So you're very focused on authority figures who can tell you what's safe and what's dangerous, who's us and who's them, who's right and who's wrong, what's healthy and what's harmful, what's permitted, what's impermissible, what's a safe word and what's a naughty word. And that dividing the world into twos is necessary for human survival at certain stages. Yes, you can ride your bike on the sidewalk. You cannot ride your bike in the street. That's a dualistic framework that you really need as a child when you don't understand very much. And when you're in this stage, you ask a lot of questions because you believe that there's an answer to every question. And for a while, you believe that adults know the answers. Eventually, you start to wonder about that. And if you think that an adult doesn't know the right answer, your assumption is, if I could just find another adult, they would know the right answer. And maybe it's been a long time since you ever felt that way, but I remember being a freshman in college, and I was part of the Jesus movement. And our little Jesus movement community, there was a big theological battle going on. Methodists understand this battle. It was the battle between free will and predestination. I didn't know that it was a battle between Calvinists and Arminians, but the battle was free will and predestination. And I remember our group was being torn apart by this controversy. And I was brokenhearted because this group meant so much to me. And I was sitting in my car praying for wisdom. And I thought, I'm 19 years old. I don't know the answer. I have it figured out by the time I'm 20 or 21, I'm sure. And it was just this feeling that every problem was solvable if I could just find the right authority figure who could tell me the right answer. And for people in stage 1, life is like a war because you're either right or wrong. You're either friend or enemy. You're either saved or damned. You understand? And awful lots at stake. So when I'm in stage 1, I'm looking for an in-group to belong to, and this in-group is right. And this in-group is in a life or death battle with all of the dangerous and wrong and erroneous out-groups. Now listen, there is one way of being a church leader and church planter that really can make a splash in the stage 1 market. You just have to prove that you're right and everybody else is wrong. And you're better and everyone else is worse. But when people are in this stage, you understand, they're not, so I grew up fundamentalist. We weren't trying to be ignorant. Our entire group, our entire social life, our entire theological framework happened under a ceiling, and stage 1 was below, and you couldn't break out of it, or you were no longer a Christian. And so religion has very, very deep connections with stage 1 work. I will explain why I think that's important, why I think that happens in a minute. But more and more of us at a younger and younger age no longer can stay in stage 1. And so we break out of stage 1 simplicity into stage 2 complexity, and we go from being dualistic to being pragmatic. So, look, sex often has a lot to do with this. Back when I was growing up, the issue of homosexuality, bisexuality, all that was not an issue. We didn't talk about homosexuality. We didn't talk about sexuality. It's sort of a wonder that babies ever got born in our background. But I had a crush on this girl, and we started dating, and she was Jewish. And her family invited me for Passover dinner at their house. And as I was sitting there at Passover dinner, I was feeling super uncomfortable, thinking, if the people at my church knew I was here, I would be in a lot of trouble because I'm outside of safe home territory. I'm on enemy territory. But here's the thing that was happening to me. I thought, wow, these people love each other. Wow, these people have deeply held beliefs. Wow, they revere the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Pharaoh, and they're dealing with some of the same. And they're as sincere and sure about what they believe as I am about what I believe. How am I going to get along in a world that's this complicated? So now what's happening is the old dualism, it's your only way to think. It's the only tool set you have, but you're starting to need to make modifications. I call it fine print on the dualistic contract. And you realize there are different people, and they were brought up in different ways, and they think differently. And so you learn, when I'm around these people, I have to use these code words. And when I'm around these people, it's a different game. You deal with this when you're in university. It begins in secondary school, but you really feel it in university. You go to biology class, and you learn biologists have a certain set of rules to the game. And you leave there, you go to economics class, it's a different set of rules to the game. You go there and you go to psychology class, a different set of rules. And then you find out in the world of psychology, the Skinnerians have a different view than the Rogerians and have a different view than the Freudians. And you understand, oh gosh, there's all these different sets of rules that you have to play by. This is the complexity game. You need more and more information. And you're looking for people who can be coaches to you to help you deal with complexity. You don't just want them to tell you who's right and who's wrong at stage 2. Those people are a dime a dozen from your background. But now you're looking for people who can help you navigate a complex world. I remember I went to my a youth worker I knew who knew about, and I was sure he knew about Calvinism and Arminianism or free will and predestination or whatever you want to say. And I went to him and I said, Dave, what do you think about predestination? He goes, well, as I see it, there are 5 different views on this question. In my entire life, there were only 2 views, the right view and the wrong view. And he said, and of these 5, here's what they are, and I can live with these 3. These 2 don't make a lot of sense to me, but there are good people who believe all 5. In so doing, he was my first gangplank, or my first passageway or portal into stage 2 thinking. And stage 2 was so much fun because there's so much to learn. And now on every question, there's multiple options, and you want to explore them, and you want to learn about the arguments between them. And so you become focused on the steps and techniques to success. Now, all might not be known or knowable, but now all is doable. You can find a way to do it. You can find a way to make it work. And life is a set of games. What are the rules of the game? Now, look, my friend David Dark often speaks about the prayer trade. Religion has a set of games. Get enough parking, get enough, this and that, get enough. And a lot of that works. It's pragmatic. It works. It's pragmatics. And I would imagine for all of you who are younger and you're working in church settings, you've heard about the decade of the 1990s with the megachurch movement, and you've watched the unsteady realities of megachurches in recent years. But in many ways, the church growth movement, the megachurch movement, was a lot of stage 1 Christians getting permission to be in stage 2. And what they did is they said, look, we're going to focus on different questions and different things. We're going to find meaning not in being right and calling everybody else wrong. We're going to find meaning in being successful, in achieving our goals, and in being effective. And we're going to help you learn on your own because you're a thinking person and you've got to sort these things through. And so in stage 2, I got introduced to Bible study methods. And instead of listening to a preacher who tell me there's one way to think, here's the truth, way to interpret this text, we were put in a group and we'd read a passage and we'd listen to each other and we all had something to say and we'd evaluate different options. Very exciting learning experience in complexity. Now, just with those 2, think about a person who is looking for a church, who's a stage 1 person. And when they come through the door, what are their expectations of you? And then think of a stage 2 person coming through the door, and what are their expectations of you? And suddenly you start to realize, no wonder so many people don't like me. It's not about me. No wonder so many people don't like our church. Well, it's not about your church. It's about the expectations that they have. Because here's the thing. There are stage 1 church people, and there are stage 1 unchurched people. And there are stage 2 church people and stage 2 unchurched people. But when you're a church person, you tend to treat everything as if it's a matter of spiritual importance. So when you're a religious stage 1 person, it's really intense. And when you're a religious stage 2 person, it's really intense. I think we have very, very few churches in America that are not stage 1 or stage 2. A lot of the struggles of the last several decades have been struggles between stage 1 and stage 2 ways of doing things. For all the Methodists here, it's an interesting way to think about Methodist history, to think that when John and Charles come on the scene, they're coming on the scene at the failure of Protestantism. The Protestantism that they've inherited has this sort of arid, dead Presbyterianism that is super intellectual, super stage 1, and super rigid and fundamentalistic. And then there's this very sort of laissez-faire, complacent, lazy Anglicanism that's on the scene. And they come in and they think, gosh, the options aren't great. And also, the poor people from the rising underclass of industrialism who are working in mines and soon will be working in factories, they think religion doesn't make sense to these people. And there's this class structure. And so what do? They develop a methodology. What's methodology? It's stage 2. In some ways, Methodists, their innovation was inviting people into a stage 2 way of being Christian by focusing on the method of becoming a different kind of person. Unfortunately, anything that came to America from Europe would always be dumbed down back to stage 1 because America was in a very big stage 1 project. You understand? The American project was a stage 1 project in the beginning because it was white people who were in a project of white supremacy, stealing the lands of the native peoples and stealing the lives and labor of enslaved, kidnapped Native Americans and people of African descent. And they had to double down on stage 1 because what they were doing was so terrible, it demanded a huge amount of effort to persuade themselves that they were righteous. So our history just seized with these kinds of tensions right up until today. More and more people at a younger and younger age are leaving stage 1 and moving into stage 2. More and more people at a younger and younger age become disillusioned with stage 2 because they say, you're telling me how to be successful. You're telling me how to climb the ladder, but the ladder's leaning against the wrong building. And now I'm wondering about this whole thing. You taught me a version of history, and your version of history doesn't make sense. You taught me a simple morality, and that morality is turning people into bigots. You are so obsessed with your theology, and we're destroying the ecology of the earth. Why should I listen to any of this? And suddenly, stage 2 begins to disintegrate, and there's deep alienation, and people move into stage 3. We could call this, we go from dualism to pragmatism to relativism and skepticism. To say, yeah, they think they're right, and they think they're right, and they think they're right, and the only thing I think is that none of them are as right as they think they are. And I'm not even sure about that myself, right? So it's a powerful move. And when people move into stage 3, other people get mad at them and blame them and criticize them as if they had any choice. Look, I think about a friend of mine, grew up Roman Catholic, and when he was molested for the first time by a priest, and he believes with all of his heart that priests are performing the magic every Sunday in the Mass of the of transubstantiation of the elements, and they're part of this magic that's the only way that people won't spend an eternity in hell or a really long and painful time in purgatory. He has so much reverence for the priests. The first time when he was molested, you can understand him thinking, that's just one bad apple, something went wrong there, and I'll keep the system together. But the second time, where was it going to go? And then when he told his mother, and his mother told him to never tell anyone. You understand, that sort of thing happens to enough people, and they keep quiet about it for a long time, and then finally they can't keep quiet anymore, and they tell somebody else. And suddenly it's safe for them to come out as stage 3 people. And now, instead of being dependent like in stage 1 or trying to be independent in stage 2, we become counter-dependent, because the only way we're going to make any progress is, in a certain sense, by leveraging against what we've been in the past. And now I might revere science because science challenges superstition and dogma, or I might be a rebel and an iconoclast. But I'm focused on questioning as much as I can question, and my ethic is an ethic of suspicion because I have good reasons to be suspicious. And now, all is not knowable, all is not doable, all is subjective and deconstructible. And life is a protest against the lies that everyone makes agreements to live by. Life is a protest against the authoritarian power struggles of the stage 1 communities and against the pragmatic and superficial, profit-driven strategies of stage 2. And so perplexity is a very dynamic and highly carbonated and caffeinated stage of life. And maybe otherwise medicated too sometimes. An awful lot of people at this stage who grow up in the church leave Christianity because they have never seen any expression of Christianity that isn't thoroughly stage 1 or thoroughly stage 2. And they might convert to another religion because the other religion might have some room for stage 3 people. What often happens is if they do stay Christian, they find some Catholic retreat center or some weird little church over there that introduces them to things like solitude and contemplation and spiritual direction, where in a certain sense, it's safe to be honest about what's really going on. Obviously, the whole issue of LGBT equality is right in the middle of all this because in the stage 1 settings, there were clear answers to this, and we know who's an abomination and who's orthodox. And in stage 2 settings, it's like all kinds of, look, we don't want to make this a big issue, so we'll just be quiet about it. But when push comes to shove, the stage 1 people have the money, and so their desires rule. And in stage 3, people just say, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. And I find meaning in in-group critique and seeking honesty and justice. You understand, in stage 1, you learn to critique out-groups. And in stage 2, you learn to critique ineffective people and failures. But in stage 3, you critique your own in-group. And this is a challenging and dynamic time. And I mentioned that I live in Florida, which, Florida is the state that exists to help all other states feel that the weather could be better and everything else could be worse. But we're happy to help. You watch what's going on in my state right now, seeing higher education be a target. What's the target? Higher education is the place that has made room for stage 3 people, especially graduate school. Because in undergraduates, you read textbooks that pretend that the scholars agree. In graduate school, you learn that the scholars disagree, and you have to understand that everything is contested, and you have to learn to evaluate and think for yourself and think critically. And when I wrote Faith After Doubt, as I talked about it, I was trying to help people understand that doubt is what happens when you move from one stage to another. So to move from stage 1 to stage 2, you have to go through doubt. And when you move from stage 2 to stage 3, everything is in doubt. And here's what I realized as I wrote that book. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. Doubt is the enemy of authoritarianism. And so, and we could talk about this later if you'd like, but this is a really big deal not just in our churches in our country, but in our world right now. And many people spend the rest of their lives in stage 3 because they have never seen anywhere to go, spiritual or secular, beyond stage 3. But more and more people are finding that there are these people who've explored territory beyond stage 3. And I'm calling this stage 4 harmony and solidarity. And here's what happens. When you're stage 1 and you climb out of stage 1, you have to break through the ceiling and carve a hole in the roof and climb out, and you see a little bigger world. You are so glad to escape from those stage 1 people who just make your skin crawl. And you're just glad to be done with them. And then you get into stage 2 and you're among interesting people who are curious and trying to get things done. You're so happy. After you spend some time with them and you start moving into stage 3, you just think, I'm so tired of this endless realm of activity where we never ask any deeper questions. And you break away from them and you're so glad to be done with them. And then you spend time in the stage 3 world where everyone is homogeneously alienated. But then you find out they're alienated about different things. And then you find out that everybody is at each other's throats because everybody has X-ray eyes and can see through everybody else. But there is nowhere to go from there, because then if you just say, and so I'm sick of these stage 3 people too, do you understand what's happened? You have nowhere left to go. And so part of the breakthrough into stage 4 is saying, when I was in stage 1, I was doing the best I could. And when I was in stage 2, it was a step up from stage 1. I was doing the best. And when I've been in stage 3, and something happens to you when you say, all of these people are doing the best they know how to do. And at that moment, you become non-dual in the sense that now, instead of dividing people and separating from people, you're trying to say, we're all just human beings trying to figure out how to make it through till our mortality. And now you start integrating, you start saying, oh, there was work to do in stage 1, and there was work to do in stage 2, and there's work to do in stage 3. And we're all in this together, and now it becomes interdependent instead of counterdependent. And now you're looking for someone who can bring you some bigger wisdom that sees things whole, that integrates things. And now you are looking for the ability to not suppress your critical thinking, but to let your critical thinking expand into more contemplative thinking and engagement. And this is the stage where you start to see connections, and this is where you learn to hold knowable and unknowable together. I think about a friend of mine who happened to be a pastor and he was a stage 2 pastor. He built a mega church at a very young age. And then he reached stage 3, and he went public to his congregation with some of his doubts and some of his questions. And wouldn't you know it, by a weird coincidence, he was diagnosed with cancer at a young age. And all the stage 1 people said, it's God's judgment on you. And it was just a devastating, he called me weeping in the middle of the night once. And he was really on the verge of losing his mind. And thank God he made it through chemotherapy and all the rest. And he called me one day and he said, I think my faith is back, but it's way simpler now. All I really know anymore, all I really believe is that life is a gift and love is the point. And it was interesting how harmony and solidarity created a new kind of simplicity. And now we find a meaning in love and in connection. Now, you might say, why is it that stage 1 has so much power? Why is stage 1 seem to be where this locus of power is? And I think it's because everybody is born in stage 0, which we'll say narcissistic. When you were born, you didn't care about anybody else. All you cared about was yourself. You would wake up your mother in the middle of the night. You would poop on your father. You would pee on somebody. You would throw up on somebody. You never said thank you. You never said please. You never said I'm sorry. As far as you were concerned, the rest of the world existed to keep you dry and full and warm and happy, and they weren't doing a very good job of it. But then you started to grow, and what you grew into was stage 1. Does that make sense? You learned there are right and wrong and polite and impolite. And so we all start at this super dependent, caretaker-focused, survival, security, comfort needs predominating stage. And so stage 1 is important in every single generation to help people move to stage 2. But here is the problem that I think all of you are probably, this is maybe what even drew you into the work you're doing. It's that you realize that when Christianity and God and faith and Jesus are fused with a stage 1 mentality, what could be so beautiful can also be so ugly. What could be so healing can also be so damaging. And so I'm going to suspect that a big part of what drew you into ministry in the kind of churches that you're leading is that you are not really interested in just creating stage 1 Christians. You actually are interested in helping people be in a lifelong path of growth. And just to add one more level of reality to this is that I think if a person moves into stage 4 and they stay there long enough, it becomes comfortable and it becomes a new simplicity. And guess what? If you stay there long enough, you'll meet new complexity. And if you stay there long enough, and I think that process probably keeps repeating a few times in our lives until we get to the point where the skills of each stage just become skills that we have and have integrated in our lives. And in a sense, we're never done with all of this work. We're always learning to integrate this through our lifespan. So as I said, there are religious and secular versions of each stage. People convert to Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or Hinduism or atheism or agnosticism. They deconvert, they join and leave churches as they transition to new stages. And right now, stage 1, evangelicals and Catholics are the elephant in the room, pun intended. And if we were in India, stage 1 Hindus would be the elephant in the room. And if we were in Myanmar, stage 1 Buddhists would be the elephant in the room. Do you understand? when people are under stress, they very often revert. The more stress, the more they revert to stage 1 and even stage 0 behaviors. But right now, what's happening in our culture is that more and more people are moving into stages 2, 3, and 4, and churches are doubling down in stage 1, and it's driving many people out of their churches because they aren't allowed to be where they are. They have to pretend they're something else. And some people are willing to do that and able to do that, and other people aren't. And I'm going to guess that many of the complexities that make what you're doing so difficult really relates to this reality. And I guess the first thing I just want to say to you is it's not your fault. You didn't do this. It's not your fault. It's your struggle, but it's not your fault. You're not doing anything wrong. This is unavoidable. And if you're hoping that it's going to go away, I don't have good news for you. This is where we're going to be living our lives through the rest of our lives. And people in times like this are looking for leaders who don't hate them for being at the stage they're in, who understand that they have work to do in this stage, and who can help them do the work they need to do, and maybe when they're ready will help them even grow beyond the stage they're in now. I'd like to propose to you that the Bible has phenomenal resources for people in each stage, but many have only ever heard stage 1 or stage 2 approaches to the Bible. And I just have to say, I love the Bible too much to leave it to the stage 1 and stage 2 people. And so I think one of the important jobs we're trying to do in congregations like yours is help people see the Bible in 4-dimensional light. You can learn to address people at all 4 stages in your sermon, in your sermons and preaching and programming as a congregation. You can think, folks in stage 1 need this stuff, and folks in stage 2. What's abnormal, I think, right now is that I think what would be normal in a healthy culture would be that most people in stage 1 would be children. And by the time people were teenagers, they'd be moving into stage 2. One of our big problems now is many of the people who are the major donors to religious organizations are stage 1 senior citizens. And they don't even understand that the power that they have, but they sure know how to use it with their money. So one of our jobs is to learn in this abnormal situation, I'm going to just say it, for people who have spiritually stunted growth because of centuries of religious history. We need to touch people and serve them in each stage, but there's a way to do this that opens things up for them to keep growing into later stages. As I said, I think we have a lot of churches that are friendly to stage 1 and stage 2. I think what we've seen since 2016 is that many of those stage 2 churches have had a reversion to stage 1. I wish I could just tell you the stories I've heard in the last week of megachurches, seminaries, Christian colleges, and denominations who are having the stage 1 power clamping down to make purges of anyone who doesn't fit. And so we have a lot of stage 1 and stage 2 cultic churches. Those, if you listen, what cults are groups that give high belonging. They give you high belonging if you will give them high submission to authoritarian structures. And there's an awful lot of that out there. It happens in politics, it happens in business, and so on. And the book some of you have maybe read called "Do I Stay Christian?" In many ways, it's a book written to people in stage 3 and 4 who are trying to decide whether there's even any room for them anymore in the Christian religion. If you're a pastor or a church leader, it's hard for you or your church to lead people who are ahead of you. So sometimes it's best to invite them to lead you. And for you to take the posture of a learner because that's important. What I am advocating for, and again, feel free to disagree, but what I'm advocating for is not that we have stage 4 churches. In other words, churches that accept stage 4 people and reject everybody else and judge and condemn everybody else. I'm advocating that we have 4-stage churches, churches that make room for people in each stage, that are led by stage 4 leaders, because it's only stage 4 leaders who have the ability to include people in each stage. It's a skill that is very hard to have when you're in earlier stages. So 4-stage churches led by stage 4 leaders, and because they develop the ability to include and transcend. And because realizing that earlier stage leaders more often transcend and reject what they are leaving. So stage 4 leaders can lead earlier stages, but they do it differently. So I'll tell you a funny story about this. My daughter, who's now a college professor in her 40s, but when she was about 14 years old, maybe 15, she said, "Dad, can I talk to you in private?" So I said, okay. And her room was down in the basement, so we go down to the basement. It's the first time my 14-year-old daughter is asked to talk to me in private like this. And you can imagine where my mind is going. What am I about to learn? And I'm literally walking down the stairs, taking deep breaths, saying, okay, what's going to be? So I come into her room. She says, "Would you sit on the bed?" I sat on the bed. She stands up and she said, "Dad, you believe in evolution, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I think it's one of God's coolest creations. I'm amazed by evolution." She said, "I don't believe in evolution." Now, do you understand what was going on? Immediately, I understood. We had hired a youth pastor who had told the youth group that the senior pastor was liberal and wrong and all the rest. And my daughter loved me, but she loved this youth pastor. And here was the difference, though. She knew she could disagree with me and I would accept her. She knew she could not disagree with the youth pastor or he would reject her. So I said to her, "Oh, Rachel, if you want to believe in evolution, that's fine. No worries, Just don't lock yourself in that room because 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, you might want to change your mind. But if that's where you are now, I understand. When I was 8 years old, I believed that." I didn't say that to her. We talked about the Bible. I think the Bible is a book that shows us this progression. It begins with patriarchs, powerful men who lead. You have authority figures. They don't have law. They don't have Bible. They don't have tradition. They just lead because they're the boss. That's perfect stage 1 reality. And then what happens? We have law that's bigger than the leaders. But it's not just one leader. You only have one leader when you're in a patriarchy. And that leader then has deputy leaders, and it's almost always like a pyramidal structure of men, and then everybody else has to fit in. But in stage 2, you have law, and you have structures that are very complex, and laws, hundreds and hundreds of laws to deal with all the complexities of life. And you have the Proverbs, and you have, so the Bible has a whole set of literature that shows the development, the evolution into stage 2. And then you have books like Ecclesiastes and Job and Song of Solomon, and especially the prophets. That is pure stage 3 stuff. I mean, if you haven't read it lately, in light of this, go back and read Ecclesiastes or read Job. Job is like an opera where stage 1 people criticize a stage 3 person. And then God comes in at the end and takes them all to the zoo and says, none of you know what you're talking about, And then you think of the prophets. I think the prophets are also in stage 4. And then Mary and Jesus and Paul and John come along saying stage 4 things. Finally, at each stage, we tend to see God, not as God is, but as we are. We see God the only way we can from the vantage point of our stage. Sometimes we have experiences where we transcend our current stage. And these are often the transformative spiritual experiences that shape our lives. That's certainly been true in my life. And just because you're a pastor or a leader doesn't mean that you are no longer a disciple or a Christian. And one of the tough things about being a pastor is that people expect you've been through seminary, you know all there is to know. Well, guess what? You might know all there is to know about stage 1. But if you're going to grow through your whole life, then you've got to give yourself permission to be going through the next wave of complexity and the next wave of perplexity through the course of your life. And this is one of the reasons why conferences like this are important, so we can be together in bigger settings with bigger realities. And it's why it's so helpful to have soul friends with whom you can be totally honest about where you are, and mentors who help you, and spiritual directors who understand spiritual and human development. And the sad reality, it's just reality, is that many pastors these days are facing stage 3, and they can't admit it to anybody. I think we could all say, amen, that this is a place where you can be wherever you are. And we need those kinds of spaces. So just one last thing before we have some time for discussion. Every model has limitations, and every model is contextual. I'm not saying these 4 stages are universal. Remember I showed you that chart with all different kinds of theorists? This is just one way to synthesize a lot of people's thought. But life is messier than any of our models. Every tool can be abused to judge or oppress people. Each stage will be tempted to misuse this model in its own way. And in spite of these limitations, I think there's still some value to models like this when they're used wisely